Okay, so we're recording now and can stream it through the Facebook page. Just waiting for it to appear on the Facebook page. There we go. We're live.
Hey, hi.
How are you keeping, Kieran? Good to see you. Thank you for joining me this evening. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Okay, pleasure.
Okay, so how's life been for you with all the ups and downs with what's going on with COVID-19 in Leicester? How are you keeping?
Yeah, it's been busy. I mean, thankfully, I live in a nice enough house that my wife, daughter, and I all have a room. We have Wi-Fi, we have a garden. And we've both been able to work and earn an income, so we're fortunate. And thank God we haven't got ill yet. Work-wise, it's just been full on and very busy. Huge demand in uncertain times.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I've been on the, I'm sure you have as well, Radio Leicester a couple of times, and they're like, how's it going? And I'm like, well, hang on, let's put it on context. We've got electricity, food and water, Netflix and electricity and Wi-Fi, because I'm talking to you, we're not being bombed. So let's get it all into context. So I think there's a few people that need to check their privilege a little bit with what's been going on. Now, of course, talking to you about some of the challenging situations that you've seen, witnessed and worked in as well, which is what I really want to kind of touch on tonight, their kind of international development sector. I know from the program that I'm talking to you about today, this is day 5 of the 10-day Parallel Lives program. I've been speaking to people in India and Bangladesh today, my colleagues tomorrow in Kenya and stuff. And of course, this is probably the first thing that's affected all of us, but all affects us in different ways and really highlights the differences that we have about, people being able to wash their hands or, keep that kind of distance. You were saying there, like, your wife and your daughters have got a room each, whereas some people, they're all living in the same space. What has it made you think back this time now in the last sort of 12 months and reflect on some of the situations that you've seen in the past and wonder how those people are getting on?
Yeah, and I mean, thanks to the internet, I'm in touch with some of those people. And I mean, I guess the kind of thing is, I mean, I'm used to living, I've lived, for people who don't know, I lived in East Africa, lived in Latin America, then I worked in Canada managing programs internationally. Yeah, but I look back to, like, I was in Ethiopia for a few years, and it's brought me back to, I suppose the word is resilience, that when things like this hit, what backup, what infrastructure do you have? However much we grumble and complain about the government, and clearly there have been mistakes made, we still live in a country that if you start coughing and spluttering tonight and you can't breathe, an ambulance will probably turn up, you probably will get taken to hospital and you will get treated. And I think when I lived in Addis Ababa, there were 4 ambulances. If you were out in rural Ethiopia and you had a car crash, nobody was coming to take you out of the wreckage. And I think there are, drinking tap water, electricity. There are so many things that you just take for granted that if you live in the so-called developing world, people would come to say, like, what we would consider a rundown, horrible, estate in England with, and they'd be thinking, you have electricity, you have water, you have heating. The people would be amazed. So we're fortunate. That's not to say that people in the United Kingdom can't moan and grumble. And we know there's huge inequality, and we know in our own city that, you move across districts in Leicester and, life expectancy drops by 4 years. And I guess that's the other thing. The thing that it's really brought home to me is inequality. And there is inequality both within countries and between countries. And sadly, we live in a world where there are people with privilege who are often insulated against shocks. People somewhere in between can take a little bit, but they're a bit worried. And then there are people who are really just living day to day. And when bad things happen, they've really got no backup.
Yeah, I mean, it really does put it into context quite a bit, doesn't it? I think particularly if you come across anyone, say, like in Leicester or kind of anywhere that considers itself kind of a more advanced than anybody else, you have a chat with them and they really talk in terms of, struggling and stuff like that. And you go, you've got to put it into context. And I think, I do fall foul sometimes of people. And I know we were just talking a minute ago about technology and using technology, you can turn around and say to someone, well, why can't we be doing that here? You know what I mean? Or we've just done it and we've demonstrated it, and they'll turn around and go, oh no, it'll never work and stuff like that. And then you go places or workplaces, or you're responsible for programs like you said there, and I'm sure we'll drill down into some of those, maybe on a continent by continent basis will be the best way of doing it. That you suddenly think, well, people are just so used to finding solutions themselves, and hopefully they'll find someone that can give them the resources, kind of an international agency or the kind of charities that you work for. Whereas here, they almost use it as a reason not to try that stuff in case you hold them to account. There's always that, we've got that fear factor, haven't we, of being asked the most difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go into that, I mean, a lot of people, some of my African colleagues, or, I should say Tanzanian, because Africa's a huge continent made up of lots of countries, and you wouldn't, lots of people here wouldn't, if I described you as European, you probably wouldn't, a lot of people wouldn't like it, especially in our Brexit days. But I would say my Tanzanian and Ethiopian colleagues, which are two countries that I worked in, often they would say to you, kind of, in Tanzania and Ethiopia, you become your own state. You have to sort things out yourself. You're reliant, in terms of resilience. And once again, there's a hierarchy of privilege in those countries. So some people are more capable of, getting a generator, getting a well put in the garden, or whatever the hell it is. But in this country, we have backup and we have support. And I think in developing countries, that is often not there, for a whole range of reasons, some historic, some very present. And I think this pandemic, it just brings home, however much we talk about free markets, etc., quite often we do need strong states who can coordinate and work with the people to give us protection. And I think what is interesting though, in countries, and England's got a strong state, the United States has got a strong state in many ways, and yet they've got very high death rates. So I guess what would go alongside those strong states are political will and competence. And I think a lot of us at the moment, if you look at places like New Zealand, we're saying, are there different types of models of leadership? And I think when I look back to my time of working in Africa and Latin America, in international development, there's a very strong emphasis on listening, humble government, encouraging people to work in partnership, learn from, look for small solutions. And I'd say in New Zealand, they seem to have a PM who sees that, the value of listening, being humble, knowing what she doesn't know and seeking to work with. And I think a lot of people could learn from that.
Yes, that's almost, I dare say, a model for the future, but we could kind of do with it now in a few more places, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Governance is a really big thing, and I should imagine the places that you've mentioned there as well, the East Africa and Latin America, you'd have seen, and Southeast Asia, you'd have seen some real challenges with trying to find partners to work with as well, that maybe reflected your own, desire for transparency and governance and stuff like that. Is that one of the toughest things when it comes to working in international development as someone that's responsible for, say, a project or a region, as you've been?
Well, I think you've got to step back, because people have, different ways of doing things. Let's be brutally honest. When you talk about international development, often I worked for UK and Canadian agencies, and a lot of the funding came from the UK or Canada. And the people funding you have certain expectations about how you operate, how you spend that money, how it's accounted for. And you could call that a form of imperialism, because they're willing to give money out into empowerment, but they want it dealt with and accounted for in a certain way. What I would say to you is, like, for example, when I worked in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government, certainly when I worked there, was very committed to reducing poverty and could work with frightening sort of across the board efficiency. When they decided something was happening, it was happening. And in a way where with military-like precision, they would decide we're going to do this, you know, and if anybody got in their way, bang. The flip side of that, though, was that if you upset them or you worked to get, you couldn't work in that country. And to give them credit, Ethiopia would have said, this is our country, you come and support us. And if you start espousing ideas or thoughts that go against us, you work against us, you can get out. Now, so which meant a lot of donors found that hard to bear with. Likewise, I worked in Nicaragua, and the Sandinista government there was actually very good at mobilizing people and doing things. But if you were working with them, they were fine. But if you got on the wrong side of them, they would just kick you out. And yet people used to get annoyed with that. But I would sometimes think, well, you know, you could imagine if some foreign charity turned up in the United Kingdom and was suddenly, you know, helping people march against the government, you know, in lots of developing world countries, you know, INGOs have worked with local groups that are clashing with the government, they're supporting them and funding them. And actually what is happening now is that in lots of those countries, the government are cracking down on civil society. And one of the things often those governments are saying are, you know, we don't want foreign governments funding and pushing their agendas in our country. Now, quite often that's, you know, a little bit, they're being economical of the truth, because they're saying, well, no, actually, you know, the women in this country are against domestic violence, or the farmers in this country are against so and so, and we're just supporting them. But I think when you work in international development, you do come up against this kind of who decides what right do you have to come to our country and impose your values. And I would say increasingly, when I left, I mean, in 2016 was kind of when I moved on from, I ended up back in Tanzania. But increasingly, you had leaders saying, we're sick and tired of international development agencies, NGOs coming into our countries, telling us what to do, spreading your values. And I guess alongside that, you also have the rise of China, and China giving money to governments and saying, do you know what? We're not going to impose a lot of, you know, Western liberal value. You get on and do what you want to do. We'll give you the money to build the roads, the bridge, and the hospital. Of course, the cynic in me might say, and that's because China's put a huge down payment on Africa. They've got oil, they want access to their markets. And that was another big thing that happened. And also in a lot of the countries I worked in, there was a discovery of oil and, you know, natural utilities. That meant they were less reliant on kind of Western aid money. And I mean, it led to complicated decisions, because at one level, you're thinking, we're here, we support human rights, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, there's people saying, who the hell are you to come here espousing, you know, imposing your agenda on us? And then even if you find local partners to work with, or a government might say, look, this is our country, and if you're going to start doing this or that, we'll kick you out. I mean, a classic example, I mean, the hardest example I can think of was in Eritrea, which is one of the countries. I was a regional director in East Africa. I mean, the Eritrean government got really hard and kicked out most of the INGOs because they thought, you know, if you come here and criticize our country, it's not happening, and they booted people out. So that is something that, you know, very different. I mean, at the moment, I can get ignored and the local council or government may not fund us, but you know, we're in the United Kingdom, whereas when you work as a guest in the host country, and you've got to remember that.
And you touched on an interesting point as well there about China with its, I mean, a lot of people say China will give people money without, you know, turning around and saying, well, you need to do this about human rights and that about human rights. And again, the more you drill down into some of the dubious people that the British government claims to be our friends and allies that we've supported over the years, they tend to be more dubious and more more dodgy than, or basically the ones that care for the people, which tend to be the more socialist leaning ones, who they deal with. Now, I think from my point of view, what's the most interesting with the 100 countries that I deal with across the Parallel Lives project is the more that I talk to people on the ground, you know, the more they talk about how important it is for working with partners that want to support the solutions that they have. You know what I mean? So kind of resourcing their solutions as opposed to imposing their ideas or suggestions or do this for the funding. In your experience, you know, are there still charities now in sort of, 2021, but looking back, that you're aware of, maybe you had one eye on now and you still kind of keep up with people in the field that are still imposing those kind of things on countries they're working with? Or has the sector really taken on board that, being able to change and be more supportive of people locally rather than imposing stuff on them?
I think what it is, where it gets complex, I don't think there's a single international non-government organisation, Save the Children, Oxfam, Plan, Care, CAFOD, Goal, all of those, who would say we're imposing an agenda. However, I suspect it gets down to power. If you turn up in a country and you say, we've got £10 million to spend and we want to spend it on this, you've got quite a big say in what you're going to do, and you've got criteria and you're selecting, so there's soft partners. I mean, increasingly when I was in Africa, people would say, why, for example, is the British government funding INGOs to work in our country? Why don't they fund local, there's some fairly big, strong local NGOs. And certainly when I was in Latin America, there were really very, very sort of strong NGOs. And they would say, it's because you don't trust us. You want to work for a middleman. Actually, INGO staff are sort of soft police. And to be totally honest with you, when you work overseas, I drove around in a big car with a logo on the side and all of that. And I think, there's quite a lot of resentment and people coming. And, typically you'll go to a country, you'll spend 3 years there and you move and somebody else comes. And I think there is a growing weariness amongst nationals about that. Having said that, the alternative, when I was there, if you talk about direct budget support, it was about let's give money directly to government, support their programs, which I think donors were going to. But once again, quite often in some of those countries where you put money into government, it disappears, and it all sounds very white and colonial. If you give them money, they'll steal it. You end up in a bit of an ethical quagmire. And if you've got a sort of conscience and you're liberal, you can beat yourself up about what am I doing here? I guess the sad thing is that quite often, whether you work through INGOs, whether you work through the government, all too often in these countries, the poor are still there. If you look, that INGOs have been working in a lot of developing countries since kind of the end of World War II. So what's that, 60? That's about 75 years plus now. And in most of these countries, poverty is still persistent. Yes, we've wiped out some diseases. Yes, some progress has been made, but not enough. And so I guess you'd have to say we haven't yet found the silver bullet. But I think increasingly, also, a lot of people would say the way that you will tackle poverty, I mean, INGOs or the charitable sector, whatever you want to call it, have a role to play, but looking at things like trade relationships, fairer trade. The other big thing that came in when I was there was the whole thing about cash transfers. Actually, literally give people money rather than spend loads of money. Give everybody in the village, I don't know, $10 a month or $20 a month. They will just, even if they waste it, they spend it. It'll be in the local economy. They're spending it. It will generate money. And these are ideas that I found quite exciting. But as in anything, often there's lots of experts, and experts often, whenever you read their recommendations, they quite often say, and you need us experts to come back and do more. Yeah. I mean, I would say it is very easy to ridicule and destroy development. There is a lot of good work and there's a lot of good people, but I mean, the facts speak for themselves. There's still an awful lot of poor people in the world, and often, we're playing around the edges.
Yeah, rather than bringing about any kind of meaningful change, where we're perpetuating the myth that we need to be there. And I think also one of the things you touched on was about, nationals actually working for these INGOs as well. So it comes with an element of money and status and jobs and stuff like that. So then you're creating this division again, aren't you? Where it's not just external, it's actually creating a dependency there rather than empowering them to set up their own organizations. They're kind of working for the international organization.
Yeah, and I suppose the thing that people might not quite realize, I mean, if you say, when I was in Tanzania, for example, I think these figures might be slightly wrong, but not too wrong. The average wage in Dar es Salaam was about $70-something a month. And outside of that, it was about $27 a month. A lot of those, say, a national staff member working for me would have earned about $2,000. Now, when you start thinking about that, so actually, if you work for an INGO, you have got an absolutely massive job. And I suppose if you're, you know, if your stereotype of an aid worker is somebody in the middle of nowhere, dodging bullets, covered in blood and sweat, bravely going where no person has gone before, well, there might be a little bit of that, but actually quite often we're talking about people living in, you know, relatively extremely rich. And obviously, you know, the Mzungus, the white people are richer, but also the national staff by local standards are incredibly rich. Certainly when I was in Tanzania, if you were a smart, bright young Tanzanian, you'd have thought, I want to work for an INGO because I can earn a lot of money. I can probably travel around the world. And these things, A, distort the local economy. But it also links into that. I guess there's something about being out of touch, because even when you speak on behalf of the poor, certainly when I was working, most of the large INGOs and even the large NGOs, they were based in the capital. Yes, you would go out on tour, but most of the local staff, you know, people didn't want to live in the field. I'm a smart, bright. Why on earth would I want to go and live in bloody Lindi and Mtwara? I want to live in Dar es Salaam, I can get my kids to a decent school. And so a little bit perhaps like in the United Kingdom, you know, you get these divisions between, you know, the poor areas and richer, you know, who wants to teach in a really hard bit of an inner city. And so, I mean, INGOs, like it or not, often distort the local economy. You know, an INGO driver might earn more than, say, a hospital, a doctor in a regional hospital. You know, is that right? What does that tell you? You know, how do you deal with that? So these are big problems that we bring with us.
So if we were to look at, say, something like, INGOs and that sector, international development, as a bit of an industry, you know what I mean, where it's kind of a bit like we've got education as an industry in this country and criminal justice is an industry. I'd almost say homelessness is a bit of an industry as well. And I guess we always have to be very careful about, PPE becoming a bit of an industry as well. Everyone seems to be piling in on that as well. What we're saying is that because it's become a bit of an industry, the only way you're going to change it is through reform, or is it going to be changes through something like the government deciding not to have an international aid budget, for example, and getting rid of a department like DFID? You know, do you think that there's some of that in there as well, where it's almost becoming just a perpetual thing? We keep giving this money away. We're increasing spending, but we're cutting down on aid. But it's not a donation, really. It's an investment, isn't it?
Well, there's two things. I think these debates are a little bit eternal, but I would differentiate. So if you take emergencies, if tomorrow a tidal wave or something, you know, hits a country, you know, wipes out, you suddenly got, you know, 250,000 people are homeless, so many people died. I still think aid agencies, professionals turning up in that emergency, turning up, sorting out, getting people dealing with an emergency, sorting out, saving people's lives, all that kind of stuff. That's one sector. And obviously that's needed. And there are professional teams who can go in and deal with the aftershock. I think long-term development, which is, you know, whichever way you dress it up is more political, is where there is more debate coming in. And I think we need to have a more evidence-based approach that quite often people who work in aid have very strong values and they see the world through a lens. You know, I'm very into political action. I'm very into gender. I'm very into making markets work for poor people or whatever. And often that clouds the results. I mean, the evidence, when you review a lot of these projects, often they've not made that much long-term difference. So I think having an evidence-based, but also looking at, are there more effective ways you could use that money? And I guess the thing that I would be saying, it's about Southern Voices, is that, I mean, if I was in charge of international development or wherever you call it, I'd be seeking to work much more in partnership with local groups. I would want to see far less, you know, white people or what, you know, Mzungus bombing around in Land Rovers. I mean, one of the hassles is about what I would call transactional cost. Basically, big agencies want to give out one big grant. And actually, you know, in international development, small is beautiful. So actually, you can have $1 million and you could give out lots of little grants of $5,000, but to process that is such a huge cost. Nobody does it. So they're often also looking for big agencies. And once again, when you go to countries like Tanzania, you will get the big NGOs who are quite well known, staff who, you know, they're masters in America and Holland and the UK. And because people are a bit lazy, the money goes to those organizations. And like in any situation, and it's a bit, dare I say, if I was in Leicester now, you know, it might be there's a set of people in Leicester, the council know, they represent age, and they're having a chat within a kind of bubble where they all agree. But that might be a million miles away from if you started talking to actually poor people who lived in Belgrove or New Parks or Highfields. And, and I think sometimes you've got to break through those bubbles and think differently.
I think also that's with the same with organisations as well, isn't it? Where it's been easy historically to just give large amounts of money to organisations to go off and do things, and whatever they do with the local community, to then go with either someone new or a group of smaller organisations, probably who could do it much more efficiently because they're more up-to-date technology, fresh staff, whatever it is. It just creates more work for the organisation, like the council, to give that kind of money over, doesn't it? Now you dragged us nicely back to Leicester, which is good. You're going around my circular pathway, which was amazing. So what have you brought to Leicester, would you say, to Leicestershire Cares, where you're now the CEO, from your international development days? What are some of the main things that you look to implement in your organisation that maybe some of your staff are quite surprised about?
Well, I think when I first came in, I suppose, to be honest, I would hope a certain amount of humbleness about often very little. When I first came into Leicestershire Cares, I felt we had got into a slightly top-down way of working. We did what we did in a bit of a silo. There was, people who used the project were seen as clients. We were experts. And I'm very much more, and although it's just a word, I was very much more into, well, people are participants. We work with people together. And I guess what I brought in was let's try and work with people. Our work will be far more effective the more people are involved in it, the more we can work in partnership. But also we have to be very open about saying we don't have one of the sayings I like is nobody has all the answers, but all of us have the answers. And it's about often, a lot of things that we try don't work, and let's be open about it. We thought that would be a good idea and we tried it, and you know what? It didn't. But what we learned from doing it was this or that. So it's that. I mean, I guess, even things of, dare I say it, like when COVID-19 hit, we have got quite a lot of recognition for being very creative and very agile. And I remember on March the 23rd, we had a sort of emergency team meeting. And I said to people, it's that old saying, the Chinese symbol for crisis is the same for opportunity. And so let's not bang on about what we can't do, what we were planned. We are now here where we are. Let's be creative and agile. And I sense that some of the other agencies, from some through design and some just through fear, people probably spent the first couple of months waiting for things to go back to normal. Yeah. And also there are people saying, well, that's not my job. I'm not doing that. You can't expect me to. And I suppose I was very used to working on the hoof, having to deal with things, getting up one day and finding out, I don't know, that part, there's been a incursion in that part, we've got people cut off, the government have switched off the bloody internet, having to really just think on your feet. And I would hope that creativity and agility is coming, but linked to all of that is that you need to work with, you need to listen with people, learn, and be totally honest about lots of the things that you do aren't going to work and some things will. And most things that do work because of the input of others. There's very few things that you will do on your own that will work. We work in complicated systems and recognize that, and try and build on that. And I think that's what I brought into Leicestershire Cares. I mean, if I'd been being brutal when I first came in, we might have thought, we're great, we don't need to work with anybody else. And also we work quite closely with the private sector, so that makes us quite special. And everybody else, they're all kind of running around being a bit hopeless. And I think, that was very disingenuous to people, but ultimately we're not half as great as we thought we were. And we could be much better if we embraced other people. And I think that's something that I've tried to bring in. I hope if I left tomorrow, that would stay in the organisation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, really interesting. The trouble is, having met you a couple of times and had conversations with you, I think, there's so many things in there where you could just keep exploring that. I mean, they're kind of, if Rob was in the room, they're separate podcasts in their own right. And I know we've touched on some of this stuff as well, but let's stick to this part of the conversation. So there's two final things that I want to talk to you about. And then I've taken up more than enough of your time. Okay. The first thing is Ad International. So are you still a trustee for Ad International now? Now, obviously you're working with the the marginalised of the marginalised, aren't you, with Ad International, and really trying to get them to come together to advocate and get involved in, you know, shaping and owning their own narrative in many cases when it comes to some of the places that Ad International works. Why do you stay as a trustee?
Because I mean, number, I suppose, not at a very selfish level, because I wanted to keep my hand in. But secondly, I covered an Ad International country director post in Tanzania for 6 months, right at the end of my, if you want, overseas work. And I just thought they were a great organisation. And the same as in the UK, when you look at levels of disadvantage, on top of everything else, people with disability often come at the bottom of the pile. They are often overlooked. They are often excluded. And Ad International has a very simple but effective way of working. It works through people with disability organisations. And it's really very much about trying to give voice to those organisations, strengthening their capacity. And so, for example, when I was in Tanzania, they were doing work around trying to improve the education system. And it was brilliant, because you would go to a rural area where a kid with a disability might literally be chained up in the daytime, left alone in a room so they didn't get into trouble while their parents went out. And, you know, you probably know as well as I do, in lots of these rural communities, and people think people with disabilities are possessed by spirits, they're bad people. So a lot of work that Ad International did around raising awareness, and all of a sudden kids are going to school and they're saying, yes, that kid's got a disability. With the right support, they can, you know, they can develop, they can learn how to speak, communicate. And so it's very inspiring work, but it's also very much needed work. And I do think, yeah, I say people with disabilities are often left out. And we also know that in developing countries, due to wars, due to diseases, lack of medical, there's a lot more disabled people around, and they need to be given a voice and they need to be supported. And I personally feel quite passionate about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, spending 20 minutes looking through the Ad International website and case studies and some of the stories with a cup of coffee, I think if anyone watches that or looks at that and takes the time to look at it and then doesn't want to participate and do something, even if it's locally, to help people and feel that they can help people, I think they've not got a beating heart, to be honest. But there we go. So my final thing now is I'm always talking to my media students, and any of the work that I do in schools or colleges, or what we do here at the Dot Media Centre, is always trying to convince people that if you really want to know about people, go and speak to them. Go and visit. Don't do the tourist thing. Get involved, immerse yourself, or maybe even consider a career in the international development sector, where they're going to be looking for people to do social media and filmmaking and photography, new ways of communicating messages, maybe when the whole thing with raising funding comes about as well. How did you first get into the international development work? Was there a particular moment that you can remember?
Well, I suppose in a way, I mean, like when I went to university, I studied international relations, and I left university on the Friday, and it was a bank holiday on Monday and Tuesday. And on Wednesday, I started work for Save the Children Fund, but in their UK programme. So I worked for an international development agency, but I worked on their UK programmes. And then, like, for personal circumstances, I was unable to go overseas. But then later on in my life, so when I think I got to about I left university in 1988. So in about 2000, I was in a situation where I could go overseas, and I applied for, and I got a job in Ethiopia. If I was chatting to a younger person now who said to me, I'd really like to work in international development, assuming they've got a skill set, and like the way, let's say, for example, you've got somebody who says, I'm really good on social media, I'm good at filmmaking. VSO is a fantastic organization. You can do, if you go and spend 2 years as a VSO volunteer, that they, 99 times out of 100, they will get you on a project that matches your skills in an area, and it's going to be tough, it's going to be challenging. Unlike when you work for like the level that I worked at towards the end, you're always the headquarters, you're going to be out in the field, in the community, in the village, doing your stuff, and you will come away with a whole wealth of experience, and it will, and perhaps that first 6 or 9 months might also not what I might call the kind of super savior out of you, because quite often, you're saying, bloody people, what am I here for? I've given up, blah, blah, blah. And, there's a lot of learning. But so organizations like VSO are wonderful. Keep reading. Nowadays, of course, on the internet, there's a lot going on. a word of warning, there's a lot of sort of slightly bogus organisations out there, you know, come and help in a children's nursery, blah, 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 for rich kids, you know, you're not really doing anything of worth, they're ripping you off. I would say there are bona fide agencies like VSO, and if you go on like what different that was their website, you know, go, you know, work with proper agencies, see how you can help. The one thing that people might say to you, see, a Southern-based activist might say to you, don't come over to Tanzania, stay in your own country and get your government to change the way it works with us. We don't need you. We need you to put your, you know, give your money to help us and challenge your own government. And that's one of those things, I suppose you've got to square that up for yourself.
Absolutely, yeah. It goes. It's the frame of mind with which you arrive, I guess, as well, isn't it? Sort of, you know, what it is there you're to do, and also what are you bringing with you, and what is your aim? I think, yeah. But I mean, I often talk to students about it, and I said there's that kind of, you know, I often say to them about my mate of mine, the journalist Andrew Goss, who's written about the Pakistan earthquake. We're doing a big event with Andy on Sunday about the Pakistan earthquake and activism there. He's just talking about sort of mercenaries, missionaries, and misfits. You know what I mean? The sort of the people that he met in his humanitarian days of the earthquake. It draws people for different reasons, doesn't it? And it's getting involved and enjoying it, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's complicated, isn't it? And I suppose it's even like when I work in Leicester, where people, I mean, I work for Leicestershire Cares. We have close ties of business, and some people might say, well, you know, it's all business, it's just PR, and look at you, or even in Leicester, and look at you, you're a white middle class guy. What the hell do you know about Belgrave? So I think if ever you do this work, people will not keep it in your own country or abroad. I guess it gets back to me is about having a set of values that you're consistent, you can be open and transparent with. And I guess you say to people, look, I can, you know, this is where I'm coming from, this is where I'm at. And if you want to work with me, fine. And if you don't need me or our organization, fine. You know, I guess where it gets more complicated is if you were the British government, they might say, yeah, we'll give you 250 million, but we'll give it to you if you do it A, B, and C way rather than that way. And now I was never in that position. And I was always able to find people to work with. But I think it's about respect. And I guess, you know, one of the biggest things that you find when you travel around the world, and I've worked in a lot of countries of this, you know what? Most of us don't know that much. Do you know about how it really is? And we've all got a lot to learn. And just be humble and have an open mind, learn and just be willing to say, do you know what? I got that wrong. I made a mistake. But what I learned, my old head of monitoring and evaluation used to say to me, the only mistake we make is not to learn from our mistakes. You know,
there you go. Thank you for ending with the T-shirt. Excellent. Kieran, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it. I think there's probably people in Leicester that, one, are unaware of your expertise and experience of working overseas, and maybe there's a lot to be learnt from operating in some of those low resource settings where it's not about we don't have the money to do that project so we can't. It's more a case, well, if there isn't the money, how are we going to use what we've got in order to do those kind of things? So I think there's a lot to be learned from your experience, and thank you for sharing that with us. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it.
And you, John, and I would say, John, it's great that you're giving a platform to people. I know you've got a lot of Southern activists on the well, but I think the work you do is really well needed. It's much needed. And, you know, in a world of division and strife, people like yourself trying to spread understanding, connect people up, it's fantastic that you're doing that. So, you know, more power to you, mate. Keep up the good work.
Thank you very much. Okay, have a good evening, yeah?
And you, mate. Bye-bye.
Bye.